The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Millbrook as Sarah McKenna hurried toward the Anderson homestead, her leather satchel bouncing against her hip with each urgent step. The familiar weight of dried herbs, tinctures, and clean bandages provided little comfort against the growing knot of dread in her stomach. This was the third call in 2 weeks, another difficult birth, another family desperate for her help. Sarah had been the town's unofficial healer for nearly 5 years. Ever since she'd arrived as a war widow, with nothing but her grandmother's medical knowledge and a determination to build a new life. The people of Millbrook had welcomed her skills then, grateful for someone who could ease their suffering in a land where doctors were scarce and death came too easily. The Anderson cabin sat on the outskirts of town, its weathered wood siding gray from years of prairie winds and scorching summers. Sarah could hear Mary Anderson's labored breathing before she even reached the front porch. Thomas Anderson met her at the door, his face pale and drawn with worry. "Thank God you're here, Miss McKenna," he whispered, wringing his hat in his calloused hands. "She's been like this since yesterday evening. The baby, it won't come." Sarah nodded grimly and pushed past him into the stifling cabin. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and fear. Mary lay on the narrow bed, her dark hair plastered to her forehead, her face contorted in pain. This was her 4th child, but Sarah could see immediately that something was wrong. "Mary, I'm here," Sarah said softly, setting her satchel on the wooden table and rolling up her sleeves. "Let me help you." For the next 6 hours, Sarah worked tirelessly. She administered willow bark tea for the pain, used her skilled hands to reposition the baby, and spoke in soothing tones that had calmed countless mothers before. But despite her efforts, despite every technique her Cherokee grandmother had taught her, the baby was born still. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Thomas Anderson stared at his motionless son, his face crumbling with grief. Mary's sobs filled the small space, raw and heartbroken. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of failure settle on her shoulders. She had seen death before, too much of it, but it never became easier. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, gently wrapping the tiny form in a clean blanket. Sometimes there's nothing anyone can do." Thomas Anderson's grief quickly transformed into something darker, his eyes, red-rimmed and wild, fixed on Sarah with growing suspicion. "You were supposed to save him," he said, his voice barely controlled. "That's what you do, isn't it? Save babies?" "Thomas, please," Mary whispered from the bed, but her husband wasn't listening. "This is the 3rd one," he continued, his voice rising. "The 3rd baby that's died after you've touched it. Martha Williams' boy, the Peterson infant. And now my son." His hands clenched into fists. What kind of healer kills more than she saves? Sarah felt her blood run cold. "Mr. Anderson, grief can make us say things." "Don't you dare!" Thomas exploded, pointing a shaking finger at her. "My grandmother told stories about women like you, women who pretend to heal but bring only death and darkness. You're a witch, Sarah McKenna, a goddamn witch." The word hung in the air like a curse. Sarah gathered her supplies with trembling hands, her mind racing. She had seen this before in other towns, other places, where fear and superstition ran deeper than reason. When tragedy struck and people needed someone to blame, the healer often became the target. "I've done nothing but try to help," she said quietly, backing toward the door. "I'm sorry for your loss, truly I am." But Thomas Anderson was beyond reasoning. As Sarah hurried down the dusty path toward town, she could hear him behind her, his voice carrying on the evening wind. "Witch! Devil's woman! She killed my boy." By the time Sarah reached her small cabin on the edge of Millbrook, word had already spread. She could see the suspicious glances, the way people crossed themselves when they saw her, the mothers pulling their children closer. Mrs. Henderson, who had praised Sarah's remedies just last month, now spat in the dirt as she passed. The next morning brought a crowd to her door. Sheriff Coleman stood at the front, his weathered face grim but not unsympathetic. Behind him, a dozen townspeople murmured among themselves, their faces hard with fear and righteous anger. "Sarah McKenna," the sheriff said formally, "you're being accused of practicing witchcraft. The town council has voted. You have until sunset to gather your belongings and leave Millbrook. If you're found here after dark—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Sarah looked out at the faces of people she had helped, people whose children she had delivered, whose wounds she had tended. Now they looked at her as if she were a monster. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. As the crowd dispersed, murmuring their satisfaction, Sarah began to pack her few possessions. She had been cast out before, though never for such reasons, but she was a survivor. She would find a way to endure, even in the harsh wilderness of the Texas frontier. What she didn't know was that her exile would lead her to someone who would see her not as a curse, but as exactly what she was, a healer with a gift that demanded respect, not fear. Chapter 2. Into the Wilderness. The dying light of the Texas sun painted the endless prairie in shades of amber and crimson as Sarah McKenna loaded the last of her possessions onto the rickety wagon she'd managed to purchase with her meager savings. The ancient mare hitched to it, a gentle creature named Belle that the stable owner had been eager to sell cheap, stood patiently as Sarah secured her medical supplies and the small bundle of food that would have to last until she could find another settlement. Sheriff Coleman had kept his word about the sunset deadline, but his eyes held something that might have been regret as he watched her prepare to leave. "You sure you don't want to tell me where you're headed?" he asked, adjusting his hat against the evening breeze. Sarah shook her head, checking the rope holding her canvas-covered supplies one more time. "Better that no one knows, Sheriff. That way, when people ask, you can honestly say you don't have the answer." The older man nodded grimly. They both knew that some in the town wouldn't be satisfied with simple exile. Fear had a way of growing in the dark, and Thomas Anderson's grief had already poisoned too many minds. "The Comanche have been quiet lately," Sheriff Coleman said carefully, "but that doesn't mean they're gone. And there are other dangers out there for a woman alone. Outlaws, wild animals, the weather itself." He paused, studying her face in the fading light. "You could try Fort Stockton. It's about 4 days' ride southeast if you stick to the main trail." Sarah nodded her thanks and climbed onto the wagon seat, gathering the worn leather reins in her gloved hands. Belle shifted restlessly, eager to begin moving in the cooler evening air. "Miss McKenna," the sheriff called as she prepared to leave. "For what it's worth, I never believed what they said about you. I've seen your work. You're a healer, not the other thing." "Thank you," Sarah said simply, then clicked her tongue to urge Belle forward. As the lights of Millbrook faded behind her, Sarah tried not to think about the long, dangerous journey ahead. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of grass broken only by occasional stands of mesquite and the distant silhouettes of hills. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its lonesome call. She had traveled for perhaps 2 hours when the first drops of rain began to fall. What started as a gentle sprinkle quickly turned into a steady downpour, then became a violent thunderstorm that soaked through her thick woolen cloak within minutes. Lightning split the sky in brilliant white flashes, momentarily illuminating the landscape before plunging it back into darkness. Belle became increasingly skittish with each thunderclap, tossing her head and fighting the reins. Sarah struggled to control the frightened horse, while rain lashed at her face, and the wagon wheels found every rut and hole in the muddy trail. It was during one particularly violent lightning flash that Sarah saw them, 3 figures on horseback, silhouetted against the storm-darkened sky. Even through the driving rain, she could see they were moving with purpose, angling to intercept her wagon. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she urged Belle to move faster, but the old mare was already struggling in the muddy conditions. The riders reached her within minutes. Rough voices shouted over the thunder, and Sarah caught glimpses of bearded faces and gun belts gleaming wetly in the lightning. Outlaws, she realized with cold certainty, men who preyed on travelers, foolish enough to venture alone into the wilderness. "Hold up there, lady," one of them yelled, his horse dancing sideways in the mud. "Mighty dangerous night to be traveling alone." Sarah didn't stop. Instead, she snapped the reins and tried to urge Belle into a gallop. The wagon lurched forward, but the 3 riders easily kept pace. "Now that ain't very friendly," another man called, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "We're just trying to help." One of the riders moved closer, reaching for Belle's bridle. Sarah saw the gleam of metal in his other hand, a gun pointed casually in her direction. Her mind raced through her limited options, all of them ending badly. Then, like something from a fever dream, another figure materialized from the darkness, a lone rider on a paint horse moving with fluid grace despite the treacherous conditions. The newcomer said nothing, but his presence was immediately felt. The 3 outlaws pulled up short, their attention shifting to this new threat. Lightning flashed again, and Sarah got her first clear look at her unexpected ally. He sat tall and straight in his saddle, his long dark hair whipping in the wind. Even in the storm's chaos, there was something commanding about his stillness, something that made the outlaw's horses sidestep nervously. "Move along," the stranger said, his voice carrying easily over the thunder. His English was perfect, but there was something in his cadence, in the way he held himself, that spoke of another heritage entirely. "This ain't your business, Indian," the lead outlaw snarled, but Sarah noticed his gun hand had started to shake slightly. The stranger's response was to simply sit there, utterly motionless except for his eyes, which seemed to catalogue every detail of the three men before him. The silence stretched out, broken only by the storm's fury, until the tension became almost unbearable. Finally, the lead outlaw cursed under his breath and jerked his horse's head around. "Come on, boys. Ain't worth the trouble tonight." The three riders disappeared back into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared, leaving Sarah alone with her mysterious rescuer. She sat frozen on the wagon seat, rain streaming down her face, staring at the man who had just saved her life with nothing more than his presence. "Thank you," she managed to say through chattering teeth. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her soaked appearance, the loaded wagon, and the fear still evident in her eyes. When he spoke, his voice was surprisingly gentle. "You should not be out here alone," he said. "This is dangerous country for anyone, but especially for—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "For someone like you." "Someone like me?" Sarah asked, not sure if she should be offended or curious. "A healer," he said simply, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "I can smell the medicines in your wagon. Willow bark, sage, wild mint. You carry the sense of one who tends to the wounded." Sarah stared at him in amazement. In the space of a few words, this stranger had seen what the people of Millbrook had refused to understand. Not a witch, not a curse-bringer, but exactly what she was. A healer. "I'm Ayana," he said, guiding his horse closer to her wagon. "And you need shelter before this storm gets worse." As if summoned by his words, another bolt of lightning split the sky, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that made Belle rear in terror. Sarah fought to control the panicked horse, and when she looked up again, Ayana was already moving, leading them toward a destination she couldn't see through the driving rain. For the first time since leaving Millbrook, Sarah allowed herself to hope that perhaps her exile wouldn't end in death after all. Chapter 3. Sanctuary in the Storm. Ayana led Sarah's wagon through the driving rain to a shallow cave carved into a limestone outcropping, barely visible until they were almost upon it. The natural shelter was larger than it appeared from outside, with enough room for both the wagon and their horses, though they had to duck their heads near the entrance. "This place has sheltered travelers for generations," Ayana said, as he helped Sarah unhitch Belle from the wagon. His movements were efficient and practiced, speaking of countless nights spent in the wilderness. "My grandfather showed it to me when I was a boy. He said the spirits here are peaceful." Sarah nodded gratefully, too cold and exhausted to fully process the significance of sharing shelter with a Comanche warrior. Everything she had been taught about his people painted them as dangerous enemies, but the man carefully tending to her horse showed nothing but quiet competence and unexpected kindness. As Ayana built a small fire near the cave's mouth, positioned to draw the smoke outside, Sarah changed into dry clothes behind the canvas cover of her wagon. The warmth from the flames was a blessing after hours of cold rain, and she found herself studying her rescuer in the flickering light. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps near her own age of 28. His dark hair hung loose past his shoulders, and he wore a mixture of traditional and white man's clothing, buckskin leggings and moccasins, but also a blue cotton shirt that had clearly come from a trading post. There was something in his face that spoke of a man caught between worlds, carrying burdens she couldn't begin to understand. "You said I shouldn't be out here alone," Sarah said, once they were both settled near the fire, sharing the simple meal of hardtack and dried beef she had packed. "But you're alone too." Ayana was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if she had overstepped some boundary. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "I was cast out from my people 3 moons ago," he said, staring into the flames. "Like you, I was accused of bringing danger to those I tried to protect." Sarah leaned forward slightly, recognizing the familiar ache in his words. "What happened?" "There was a sickness in our camp. Children were dying, and the medicine man said it was because we had allowed too much of the white world into our lives." Ayana's jaw tightened. "I had been trading with the fort, learning their language, their customs. I thought knowledge could help us survive as their numbers grew. But when the fever came, I became the reason for their suffering. So they blamed you for the disease, Sarah said softly, understanding all too well. Even though you were trying to help. The council said I had angered the spirits by walking too closely with the enemy. They gave me a choice. Abandon all contact with the white world and submit to purification rituals that would strip away everything I had learned, or leave and never return. Sarah watched the play of emotions across his face in the firelight. You chose exile. I chose to be true to what I believed was right, even if it meant losing everything I had ever known. He looked at her then, and she saw her own loneliness reflected in his dark eyes. What about you? What brought you to be wandering alone in a storm? Sarah told him about the stillborn baby, about Thomas Anderson's grief turning to accusation, about the fear that had spread through Millbrook like wildfire. She spoke of the other towns she had lived in, the pattern that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Acceptance, then tragedy, then suspicion, then exile. My grandmother was Cherokee, she said, stirring the fire with a stick. She taught me everything I know about healing, but that knowledge is what makes people fear me. They want the benefits of my skills, but when something goes wrong, they need someone to blame. Your grandmother was wise to teach you, Ayana said. Among my people, healers are honored. Your gift is sacred. Sacred, Sarah repeated, tasting the unfamiliar concept. She had never thought of her abilities in those terms. The people in town called it cursed. They are fools, Ayana said with quiet conviction. I watched you with your supplies earlier. The way you handle your medicines, the care you take with each herb, that is the work of someone who honors life, not destroys it. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside their small sanctuary, Sarah felt something shift. For the first time in months, she was with someone who saw her as she truly was, not as fear and superstition painted her to be. Where will you go now? Ayana asked. Fort Stockton, maybe. The sheriff mentioned it before I left. Sarah pulled her blanket closer around her shoulders. Though I suppose it will be the same story eventually. Help where I can, until something goes wrong. Then move on again. And you? She asked. Do you have somewhere to go? Ayana shook his head. I move where the seasons take me. Hunt when I can, trade when I must. It's not the life I was raised for, but it's the one I have now. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire crackled peacefully, and the storm seemed to be lessening, the thunder moving off toward the east. Sarah found herself studying Ayana's profile, noting the strong line of his jaw, the careful way he maintained his weapons, the quiet dignity that seemed to surround him like armor. Those men tonight, she said eventually, they were afraid of you. Fear can be a useful tool, Ayana replied. It keeps predators at bay. But it's lonely, Sarah observed, being feared instead of understood. He looked at her sharply, as if surprised by her insight. Yes, it is very lonely. I understand that loneliness, Sarah said quietly. Perhaps that's why we found each other tonight, two exiles in a storm. As the fire began to die down and exhaustion finally claimed them both, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting was more than simple chance. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone in the world. And judging by the thoughtful expression on Ayana's face as he settled down to sleep across the fire from her, perhaps he felt the same way. The storm passed during the night, leaving the morning clean and bright. But something had changed in those dark hours of shared shelter. A connection had been forged that would prove stronger than either of them could have imagined. Chapter 4. The Choice of Paths. Dawn broke clear and golden across the Texas prairie, the violent storm of the previous night seeming like nothing more than a fever dream. Sarah woke to find Ayana already awake, sitting quietly near the cave entrance and watching the sunrise paint the endless grassland in shades of amber and rose. Good morning, she said softly, not wanting to disturb the peaceful moment. He turned to her with what might have been the beginning of a smile. The storm spirits have moved on. It will be a good day for traveling. Sarah nodded, though she found herself reluctant to resume her journey. The night's shelter had given her more than protection from the weather. It had provided something she hadn't realized she'd been missing. The simple companionship of someone who understood exile, who saw her skills as gifts rather than curses. As they shared a breakfast of coffee brewed over the rekindled fire and the last of Sarah's cornbread, she found herself stealing glances at Ayana. In the morning light, she could see details that the storm had hidden. The intricate beadwork on his leather vest, The careful maintenance of his weapons, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings with practiced vigilance. "You're a scout," she said suddenly, the realization hitting her. "Or you were." Ayana paused in cleaning his rifle. "How did you know?" "The way you watch everything. You see threats before they develop, opportunities before they present themselves. That's not just natural awareness. That's training." "I was war chief of my band," he said quietly. "It was my responsibility to know the land, to read the signs that kept my people safe." His expression darkened. "Until I failed them." Sarah heard the self-recrimination in his voice and recognized it. "You didn't fail them. You tried to prepare them for a changing world and they couldn't see the wisdom in it. Perhaps, or perhaps they were right, and my fascination with white ways brought the sickness to our camp." He shouldered his rifle and began packing his few belongings. "Either way, that life is behind me now." They worked together to harness Belle to the wagon, their movements falling into an easy rhythm. Sarah noticed how naturally Ayana positioned himself to watch for dangers while she focused on the practical tasks, and she realized they made a good team, her healing knowledge complemented by his warrior skills and wilderness experience. "Fort Stockton is 4 days southeast," Ayana said as they prepared to part ways. "But there's another option." Sarah paused in checking her supplies. "What do you mean?" "There's a trading post 2 days north of here, run by a man named Morrison. He's got a Mexican wife who knows something about healing, and they serve travelers heading to California. They might have use for someone with your skills." "And what about you?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I was planning to head that direction myself. The Colorado Territory has opportunities for a man willing to work as a scout or guide for wagon trains." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "We could travel together. The prairie is safer with 2 than 1. Sarah felt her heart quicken. The practical part of her mind immediately saw the wisdom in his proposal: protection, companionship, and the knowledge of someone who understood this harsh country better than she ever could. But there was more to it than practicality. Something about Ayana called to a part of her that had been dormant for too long. "What would people think?" she asked, voicing the concern that immediately sprang to mind. "A white woman traveling with a Comanche warrior." "People will think what they choose to think regardless of the truth," Ayana replied. "But Morrison's trading post serves all kinds: Mexicans, Indians, whites, freed slaves heading west. He judges people by their actions, not their blood." "And after the trading post, what then?" Ayana was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "Then we see where the trail leads. Winter is coming, and the Colorado Territory is hard country. But it's also free country, a place where people can make new lives without the weight of old prejudices." Sarah looked out at the vast expanse of prairie stretching in all directions. To the southeast lay Fort Stockton and the familiar pattern of her life: acceptance, service, eventual suspicion, and exile. To the north lay uncertainty, but also possibility, and traveling beside her would be a man who saw her as she truly was. "There's something you should know," she said, her decision crystallizing even as she spoke. "I'm not just a healer. I'm a woman who's been accused of witchcraft. Traveling with me could bring you trouble." Ayana's response surprised her. He laughed, a rich, genuine sound that transformed his usually serious face. "Woman who heals. I am a Comanche warrior, cast out by his own people and viewed as a savage by yours. I think we are already in trouble." The logic was undeniable, and Sarah found herself smiling despite her concerns. "When you put it like that, then you'll come north with me." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him. She saw strength without cruelty, wisdom earned through suffering, and something else that made her pulse quicken. Here was a man who understood exile, who valued her gifts, who offered partnership rather than protection. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Yes, I'll come with you." As they turned their horses northward, leaving the well-traveled trail to Fort Stockton behind, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with dangers and challenges she couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time since her husband had died in the war, she wasn't facing those challenges alone. Beside her, Ayana sat tall in his saddle, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, but his posture relaxed in a way that spoke of a burden shared. Neither of them spoke of love or permanence. Such words were premature, perhaps even dangerous. But something had been kindled between them in the storm, And with each mile they traveled together, that spark grew stronger. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, vast and wild and full of possibilities. Behind them lay the ashes of their old lives. Ahead lay Morrison's trading post, the Colorado Territory, and a future they would write together. 1 mile, 1 day, one shared challenge at a time. As the morning sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, Sarah McKenna and Ayanna rode north toward whatever destiny awaited them. No longer two solitary exiles, but partners bound by understanding, respect, and the growing certainty that some meetings are written in the stars themselves. Chapter 5. Morrison's Choice. 2 days of steady travel through rolling prairie brought Sarah and Ayanna to a site that seemed almost miraculous after the endless grassland. Morrison's trading post, a collection of sturdy log buildings clustered around a central courtyard, with corrals for horses and a well that promised fresh water. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and the sound of voices carried on the afternoon breeze, speaking in English, Spanish, and languages Sarah couldn't identify. "It's bigger than I expected," Sarah said, adjusting her position on the wagon seat as they approached. "Morrison's been here 15 years, Ayanna replied, his eyes scanning the buildings with practiced assessment. "Started with just a cabin and a dream. Now he's got the largest trading operation between San Antonio and Denver." As they drew closer, Sarah could see the diversity Ayanna had promised. A group of Mexican vaqueros watered their horses at the well, while discussing something in rapid Spanish. 2 black men in the worn clothes of freedmen examined saddles hanging from the porch of the main building. An elderly Native American woman sat in the shade, working intricate beadwork while keeping watch over several children playing in the dust. A tall, bearded man emerged from the largest building as their wagon entered the courtyard. His hair was silver at the temples, and his weathered face spoke of decades spent on the frontier, but his blue eyes were sharp and assessing as they approached. "Ayanna!" the man called out, his face breaking into a genuine smile. "Been wondering when you'd show up again. Heard there was some trouble with your band." "Hello, Morrison," Ayanna replied, dismounting from his paint horse with fluid grace. "Trouble is one way to put it." Morrison's gaze shifted to Sarah, taking in her travel-worn appearance and the medical supplies visible in her wagon, with the keen eye of a man who had learned to read people quickly and accurately. "And you've brought company," Morrison said, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. "Ma'am, I'm Jake Morrison. Welcome to my trading post." "Sarah McKenna," she replied, climbing down from the wagon with what dignity she could manage after 2 days of prairie travel. "Thank you for the welcome." "McKenna," Morrison repeated thoughtfully. "That's an Irish name. You wouldn't be the healer folks have been talking about, would you? Word travels fast out here, even bad word." Sarah felt her stomach clench. Even here, hundreds of miles from Millbrook, her reputation had preceded her. "I am a healer," she said carefully, "though I'm not sure what you've heard." "Heard you were run out of some town for witchcraft," Morrison said bluntly, but his tone remained conversational rather than accusatory. "Also heard you delivered Maria Santos's baby safely when she was visiting her cousin in Millbrook last month. Maria's my wife's niece. She said you saved both mother and child when things looked grim." Sarah blinked in surprise. In all her years of practicing medicine, she rarely heard follow-up stories about her successes. People remembered failures and tragedies, but they forgot the lives that were saved, the suffering that was eased. "Small world out here," Morrison continued. "Smaller than most folks realize. Ayanna, you vouching for this lady?" Ayanna stepped closer to Sarah, not quite touching, but making his position clear through proximity alone. "I am." Morrison studied them both for a long moment, his experienced gaze taking in details that probably revealed more than Sarah realized. Finally, he nodded. "Well then, that's good enough for me. Come on inside. Elena's got stew on the stove, and you both look like you could use a hot meal and a real bed for the night." The interior of Morrison's main building was a revelation. The central room served as both store and gathering place, with shelves lined with everything from ammunition and tobacco to bolts of cloth and precious spices. But it was clearly also a home, with comfortable furniture arranged around a large stone fireplace and the warm smell of cooking food filling the air. A small, dark-haired woman emerged from what was obviously the kitchen, wiping her hands on a clean apron. Her face lit up when she saw Ayanna, and she immediately launched into a stream of Spanish too rapid for Sarah to follow. Ayanna responded in kind, his pronunciation flawless, and Sarah realized there was yet another side to this complex man she was still discovering. "Eleanor, this is Sarah McKenna," Morrison said when the Spanish conversation paused. "Sarah, my wife, Eleanor. She's the real boss around here." Eleanor Morrison studied Sarah with intelligent dark eyes, then smiled warmly and extended her hand. "Welcome, Senora. Any friend of Ayana's is welcome in our home." "Actually," Morrison said, settling into a chair near the fire, "we might have some business to discuss. Elena's been saying we need someone with medical training here at the post. Too many travelers come through with injuries or sickness, and the nearest real doctor is in San Antonio." "We could offer room and board," Eleanor added, her accented English clear and precise, "plus a share of payment from those who can afford to pay. Many cannot, but we do well enough to support someone who could help our community." Sarah felt her heart quicken. It was more than she had dared to hope for. Not just refuge, but a chance to practice her healing arts in a place where diversity was accepted, even valued. "That's very generous," she said carefully, "but you should know that trouble seems to follow me. When things go wrong, people look for someone to blame, and healers make easy targets." Morrison exchanged a glance with his wife, some silent communication passing between them. Elena spoke first. "Senora, I have seen how fear makes people cruel. My first husband was killed by men who thought all Mexicans were bandits. Jake has been called an Indian lover because he trades fairly with all people. We know something about prejudice. Besides," Morrison added with a slight grin, "anyone who makes trouble in my trading post has to deal with me. And I've got friends from here to California who wouldn't appreciate interference with my operation." Sarah looked around the room, taking in the evidence of a thriving, diverse community. On the walls hung weapons and artwork from a dozen different cultures. The shelves held goods from Mexico, the eastern states, and territories she could only guess at. This was a place where differences were celebrated rather than feared. "And Ayana?" she asked, not wanting to assume his plans. "Winter's coming early this year," Morrison said, answering for him. "I could use a good scout and tracker through the cold months. California can wait until spring." Ayana nodded his agreement, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. He had chosen to stay not just for the work, but for her. "Then yes," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I would be honored to accept your offer." As evening fell over the trading post, Sarah found herself on the porch of the small cabin Morrison had assigned to her, watching the stars emerge in the clear prairie sky. The sounds of the community settling in for the night drifted across the courtyard. Children being called in from play, horses nickering softly in the corrals, the low murmur of conversations in multiple languages. Ayana emerged from the gathering darkness, moving with the silent grace she was coming to recognize as uniquely his. He settled beside her on the porch steps, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cooling air. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. Sarah considered the question seriously. 3 days ago, she had been a woman with no future, cast out and alone. Now she had the possibility of a new life, a place where her skills would be valued, and beside her sat a man who saw her not as a burden or a curse, but as a partner worthy of respect. "No regrets," she said firmly. "What about you?" "My path led me to you," Ayana said simply. "That makes everything worthwhile." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars and listening to the peaceful sounds of their new community. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people to heal, new bridges to build between different cultures and backgrounds. But tonight, Sarah McKenna and Ayana were exactly where they belonged, together, accepted, and home. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and somewhere in the darkness another answered. The sound no longer seemed lonely to Sarah. Instead, it sounded like a song of connection, of finding one's place in the vast wilderness of possibility. As Ayana's hand found hers in the darkness, strong and warm and certain, Sarah knew that her days of wandering were over. She had found her sanctuary not in a place, but in the understanding that some bonds transcend the artificial divisions that society tries to impose. Love, respect, and partnership could flourish anywhere, even in the harsh beauty of the Texas frontier. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, bearing witness to two souls who had found each other in the storm and chosen to face whatever came next together. And in Morrison's trading post, where all were welcome regardless of their past, Sarah and Ayana began to write the first chapter of their shared future, one built on mutual respect, hard-won wisdom, and the unshakable conviction that belonging isn't about where you come from, but who you choose to stand beside when the storms of life rage around you.